One of the more frustrating things when learning a fighting game is coming across a stronger player who just knows more than you do. Oftentimes they will just knowledge check you, which the fighting game dictionary describes as testing whether your opponent understands how to beat a certain attack or strategy. If they don't, you loop it until they die. Moves that are unsafe, plus unblock, strings with all kinds of properties, mix-ups that seem unavoidable, will continually be used if you don't figure out how to overcome them. The only way around this is to learn frame data, situations, and then embed it into your muscle memory. There's no guarantee this will lead you to winning, mind you. And this is part of the reason why fighting games are so difficult. The only path to getting better involves learning through constant failure against others who are better than you, constant knowledge checks. Traditional single-player games also expect learning, of course, but there are other crutches to lean on. Oftentimes you will gain more experience and become stronger, or gain new abilities that unlock a new area in a MetroidBrainia, or have linear stage-based progression that escalates the difficulty gradually. Multiplayer games can also have teammates who you can blame for your inadequacies, or who compensate for your deficiencies. No, the fighting game expects you to learn or die to spam. Interestingly though, there is now a slowly expanding tradition of single-player games that are also rooted in the logic of the knowledge check. Instead of levels or XP or difficulty or ability progression, the games are simply about what you as the player acquire in terms of information. First, we need to separate the knowledge check from the skill check, which are overlapping but distinct. For example, in Sekiro and Bloodborne, some of the first bosses you encounter are meant to serve as a skill check, but they also function as a knowledge check, in that you need to understand the mechanics of the game reasonably well. In Sekiro, unless you learn how to parry, you are pretty much out of luck if you want to progress past a certain point. So the knowledge check exists in part across many games, but what separates the knowledge check game is that knowledge is their primary currency. Take The Witness for example, a non-linear puzzle game that takes place on an open island. The game starts off fairly contained, teaching you the core mechanics of needing to draw lines on panels to solve them. However, you don't unlock new mechanics or gain new abilities in this game. No, you simply learn what the rules of different symbols and panels are, whether it be separating black and white tiles, having to trace around objects in the environment, or even account for things like light and color. What's fascinating about The Witness is that it takes its own premise seriously. It is self-consistent. You might run into panels that you don't know how to solve at first, but come back later having acquired the knowledge, and access to new areas and secrets was always available. In fact, and this is a major spoiler, so skip to the timestamp to avoid them, you can end the game, so to speak, right at the beginning, if you know how to look for lines not just on the panels but in the environment itself. This is the hidden revelation at the core of The Witness. Equipped with the knowledge that the world around you is bound by the logic of puzzles, the island transforms itself, yielding new insights for us as we explore its various implications. In a competitive context, knowledge checks can be infuriating. You just have to study to be able to compete. In chess, there is absolutely no way you are going to be able to compete against players who have memorized multiple lines of every opening move. In games with hidden information like poker, knowledge of your opponent's hand renders the game redundant. These are games about information brokerage after all. However, it is the puzzle game that highlights knowledge checks the most, because it is a game about knowledge both mechanically and aesthetically. I've heard numerous suggestions for a name for this subgenre, knowledge-based games, MetroidBrainias. But as we see with the relevance of knowledge checks to other genres, this is a design philosophy and aesthetic that permeates other genres and games in different measure. Looking at a game like Toki Tori 2, we see a game that invokes the conventions of MetroidBrainias and puzzle games alike, but modulates it with the knowledge check. In the game you have two abilities, a stomp and chirp. These abilities allow you to interact with the animals and objects around you, drawing certain things towards you or pushing them away with a stomp, getting a frog to eat a fruit which then emits a bubble which allows you to float, getting birds to pick you up, sequences of chirps giving you special abilities. These objects all interact with each other. You can distract birds who are picking you up with other animals to allow yourself to fall. You get the gist. It's sort of an ecosystem game. Now the thing about the abilities in Toki Tori 2 is that they are all available to you from the start. It's just having the knowledge to do so that mediates the experience. This allows you to sequence break, find areas you shouldn't know to access at the start. But unlike other Metroidvanias, there is no ability to unlock. It's something you could have always done. The ultimate goal of the game can also be tackled in any order, reinforcing this aesthetic of freedom. We can contrast this ecosystem game to another, Rainworld. You play as a slug cat, trying to survive in a harsh environment whilst figuring out what is going on. Rainworld doesn't have puzzles in the conventional sense, but what allows you to progress through the world is an understanding of all its intricate systems, movement and environmental, none of which are explicitly explained. For example, each of the animals you encounter has their own procedural AI that governs how they interact with you, and moreover, knowledge of how these traits interact is essential for survival. Lizards might try to take you to their den, but another lizard will fight for you as well, giving you a chance to escape. There are other mechanics with regards to cycles, where you have to accomplish your task within a window of time. Both games are fascinating in how they ask the player to figure out not just the rules of the world and the objectives, but also how objects and creatures within it interact with each other. Toki Tori creates a fascinating puzzle game out of this. Rainworld creates an existential nightmare, where you're acutely aware of your powerlessness in the face of forces much stronger than you. Like The Witness, the knowledge check is being leveraged to communicate a theme about the fragility of existence and how knowledge can aid us in overcoming it. I called it sequence breaking in Toki Tori too. However, if this is baked into the design of the game, I don't think this can be called a sequence break technically. Sequence breaks are most commonly referred to in speedrunning games, where a mechanic or glitch allows you to skip levels, overcome geometry, and transcend designer intentionality in the order of operations in the game. The game Neon White foregrounds this aspect of speedrunning games, unlocking a mechanic called Insight once you get a good enough time, that shows you how to take a shortcut through the level, portraying how speedrunners go about framing a space for sequence breaking. The reason I bring this up is that it illustrates something essential about knowledge that is counterintuitive at first. Knowledge is a mechanic. Environmental objects are mechanics. Normally we think of mechanics as tangible things, verbs, actions we can do. But a lot of the time, mechanics are just in our head or embedded in the environment. Brian Upton, in his book The Aesthetic of Play, shows how there are inactive actions called anticipatory play, like what is happening between two turns in a chess game. Nothing is happening, but a lot at the same time in the players' heads. They are calculating a decision tree. Knowledge-based play is literally an unlock in our heads. It unlocks a constraint in the environment and the manner in which we can interact with it. It's epistemology in action, how we know things. This reveals a weakness about knowledge-based games though. Once you experience it once, you can never experience it again. It is ultimately about the process of insight itself, knowledge acquisition. Puzzle games are susceptible to this, at least those with single solutions and not systems-driven games. I point this out because talking about these games without spoiling them is impossible. The revelation, the aesthetic. In Outer Wilds, which you should just leave and go play if you haven't already, you are a new space explorer about to go on their first voyage. Spoilers ahead. Once you are acquainted with the controls and mechanics and take off, you are free to go wherever you want. As those who have played know though, eventually the star at the center will explode after 22 minutes, forcing the players to loop, and be prompted with the implicit question, how do we stop this from happening? Like The Witness, you can literally just finish the game at the start, assuming you have the knowledge to do so. There is no sequence breaking required, or arbitrary ability gating. It's just knowledge. The adeptness of the design here is that it marries an aesthetic of curiosity and exploration with the knowledge check, framed by an inevitable death that can only be overcome by indulging the knowledge-based progression of play. Each of the areas in the solar system you explore will reveal new mysteries and give you insights about the happenings elsewhere, inspiring curiosity-driven gameplay. For example, you might discover an escape pod, which tells you something about the lore of the world, but also clues you into the existence of other escape pods. To get to the ending requires a few key pieces of information: the eye, the vessel, and the warp core. I'm keeping it vague in case people who haven't played it are still here. To acquire this knowledge requires knowledge of other things in turn: cyclones, jellyfish, teleportation. In any case, this knowledge is not gleaned in a linear fashion. It is spread out across the world and must be pieced together by the player. Knowledge checks also govern how you traverse and reach areas, using weightlessness to overcome gaps, needing to be at the right place at certain times, understanding the principles of the quantum moon, an understanding of not just abilities, but the very properties of space, time, and the meaning of it all. Like The Witness and Rainworld, the triumph of the design here is how these elements are leveraged for artistic expression. We are given a canvas not just to interrogate the workings of our own mind, but about the patterns of the cosmos, the mysteries that it holds. Most importantly, the meaning we imbue this process of discovery, given how finite our time is, and inevitable our deaths. It does this by leaning into the contrivances of games, loops, deaths, knowledge, insights, and then framing this with a narrative that must be unveiled, but is relatable to all. Talking about these types of games must remain frustratingly vague, because like I said, anyone who experiences these games blind knows how they can only be experienced once. Specifically, I think games like The Witness and Outer Wilds are as transformative as games like Breath of the Wild and Elden Ring were for their genres, except they're designed so subtle and intricate that it is much harder to not just replicate, but articulate what even makes them so good in the first place. To do this, we need a language to express how knowledge is a mechanical process, which in turn generates an aesthetic that can be repurposed into any number of genres, themes, and stories.